She came to the steps of Ashford House on the 3rd morning of November, the same morning the Duke of Ashford received his first petitioners of the season, and the footman at the door did not know what to do with her. She was not the sort of woman one expected at a duke's steps. Her cloak was the color of field mud, patched at the left shoulder with a piece of wool that did not match, and the hem had been let down twice and still fell short of her boots. Those boots were cracked at the toe, stuffed at the heel with folded linen. She carried nothing except a small bundle tied with cord and pressed close against her body as though the cord alone kept her standing. Her hair, gone entirely white, was pinned under a cloth that had once been blue. She was perhaps 60 years of age, perhaps 70. She held herself very still, the way women hold themselves still when stillness is the only dignity left to them. "Petitioners at the east door," the footman said to her. He pointed. He did not look directly at her face. She said, "I am not a petitioner." The footman looked at her cloak. He looked at her boots. He looked at the bundle. He said, with the studied patience of a man performing mercy, "The east door, ma'am." She did not move. Her eyes, which were gray and entirely without apology, traveled past him into the hall, as though she were already accounting for what she found there. That was the moment Eleanor Maitland saw her. Eleanor was crossing the front hall with a letter in her hand, on her way to the library where she worked each morning between 7 and 10 as secretary to the Dowager, Lady Constance Ashford, who did not acknowledge that the position of secretary had existed before Eleanor filled it, and would not acknowledge Eleanor's name if anyone of rank was near enough to hear. Eleanor was 24 years old, the daughter of a Cheshire clergyman dead 3 years, possessed of no fortune and no connections, and a quality of attention that some people found unnerving and the Dowager found useful. She had lived at Ashford House for 11 months. She had learned in those 11 months to walk quietly and witness everything. She stopped when she saw the woman at the door. Something pulled in her chest, the way a thread pulls when a knot is tested from the wrong end. The footman had begun his explanation of the east door a second time. The woman in the mud-colored cloak did not speak again. She only waited, her hands folded over the bundle, her gray eyes patient as winter. Outside, the November street went on its business around her. Carts and voices and the particular gray light of a city morning that has decided not to warm. She stood inside that coldness as if she had been standing inside it for a very long time. If you have ever watched someone hold their dignity inside a body the world has stopped accounting for, you will understand what Eleanor saw in that doorway. Eleanor crossed the hall and addressed the footman. "I will see to this, Thomas," she said. She used the voice she had developed for situations in which being ignored was not an option, low and very clear. Thomas looked relieved. He stepped back. Eleanor looked at the woman. The woman looked at Eleanor. Something shifted in her expression, very briefly, the way a candle shifts when a door opens somewhere in the house. She said, "I am not a petitioner." Her voice was low and careful and had, Eleanor thought, once been educated. "I did not say you were," Eleanor said. "Will you come inside?" The woman came inside. The woman's name was Agnes. She offered no surname. She sat in the small anteroom off the hall, the room where petitioners were asked to wait before being told the Duke was not available, and she held the bundle in her lap and looked at the cold fireplace. There was no fire in it, because no one had thought to lay one for the anteroom in November. Eleanor noted this and went to the kitchen herself, which the Dowager's housemaids found baffling, and the kitchen boy found touching. She carried back a small tray with tea and a piece of bread and set it on the table beside the woman. Agnes looked at the bread for a moment with her gray eyes and then looked away. "I would see the Duke," she said. "The Duke sees petitioners between 9 and 11, Eleanor said, "at the east door." "I am not a petitioner," Agnes said for the 3rd time, and the patience in her voice was the kind of patience that comes from having said the true thing many times in front of people who were not going to believe it. She spread her hands on the table, palms down, a gesture that was not supplication and not demand. A gesture of plain fact. "I was sent to the east door in March. I was sent to the east door in June and in September, and 3 weeks past I was removed from the steps by 2 footmen. I have been coming to this house in one form and another for 9 months. Eleanor set down her own cup, and before that, Agnes's hands closed on the table edge. "Before that," she said, "I was in Northumberland, and before Northumberland I was here." She looked around the anteroom with a careful measuring gaze, the gaze of someone who has stored the dimensions of a room in memory and is now checking them against what remains. This room was a sewing room, she said. There was a window seat with a green cushion. It faced west. Eleanor looked at the room. There was no window seat now. There was a plain bench against the wall, painted dark, and a table, and 3 chairs, and the cold fireplace. She looked at Agnes. Agnes untied the bundle. Inside the cloth was a miniature portrait in a silver frame, small enough to fit inside a coat pocket. The frame was bent at one corner. Inside the oval, a young man sat in a painted chair, perhaps 17 or 18 years of age, dark-haired and level-eyed, with a particular set of jaw that came, Eleanor had learned in 11 months, from the Ashford line. Beside him the portrait sat a woman, younger than Agnes by 30 years at least, with a child's soft face and gray eyes and a white ribbon in her hair. Eleanor looked at the miniature. She looked at Agnes. Agnes said, "I have been trying to reach him for 9 months." The east door, Eleanor understood, had been the answer those 9 months had produced. She said, carefully, "Who are you?" Agnes's hands closed over the miniature again. She pressed it to her chest. She said, "I am his mother, the Duke of Ashford, whose name was Richard, who had been the 4th Duke since his father's death 6 years past, who was 33 years old, who had the particular set of jaw Eleanor had learned to recognize across a room, was at that moment in his study receiving a solicitor named Burnham, and a stack of documents pertaining to the northern estate. He had been awake since 5. He had eaten nothing. He was not a man who appeared to require food or sleep or warmth in the way that other men did. He moved through his house like weather, through a building, present everywhere and experienced as pressure, rarely as contact. Eleanor had worked at Ashford House for 11 months. She had spoken directly to the Duke on 7 occasions, each one resulting from a circumstance the Dowager had failed to anticipate. She had observed him on perhaps 40 more. She knew his voice, which was low and not unkind when he was not being overheard. She knew that he sat sometimes in the small library off the east wing at 8:30 in the morning with a book he did not read, and that the page he held open was always the same page. She knew that when his ward, a girl of 8 named Cecily who lived at Ashford House under some arrangement, Eleanor had never been told the particulars of, came to him with a question, he answered it directly, without talking down, which Cecily appeared to require, and which not all men of his rank had worked out how to provide. She knew he had been a different man before his wife died, because the servants said so when they thought she was not listening, and that his wife had been dead 4 years. She did not know he believed his mother was dead. She did not know this until she found, that same morning, the letter. She found it because Agnes asked her. Agnes asked her the way a woman asks a thing when she has exhausted all other means and has only this one left. She pressed Eleanor's hand, the grip still strong under the cold skin, and she said, "There is a letter. He was sent a letter when it was decided I was gone. If you could find it, if you could show him the writing, he would know my hand." She stopped. She looked at the cold fireplace. "He used to know my hand. I wrote to him every fortnight when he was at school. Every fortnight for 6 years without interruption." She smoothed the cord on the table with one finger. A boy remembers a handwriting like that. Eleanor went to the library. The Dowager kept everything. This was one of the things Eleanor had come to understand about Lady Constance, who was precise and careful, and had managed the Ashford household for 6 years, with the specific competence of a woman who had decided that competence was her only remaining power. Every letter, every bill, every document pertaining to the household since the 4th Duke came into his title was indexed in the library, in the 2 leather-bound ledgers the Dowager had maintained herself, in a hand so exact it might have been engraved. Eleanor had spent 11 months in that library. She knew where everything was. She looked in the ledger for the year following the old Duke's death, the year the 4th Duke had inherited. She looked for correspondence filed under the heading of family. There were 7 letters from a solicitor in Edinburgh. There were 3 from a clergyman in a parish Eleanor did not recognize in Northumberland. There were 2 from a physician, also in Northumberland, regarding the condition of a patient and the eventual settlement of her effects. The patient was not named. The physician's letter referred to her as the woman, and then as the deceased. Eleanor sat very still in the library with the physician's letter in her hand. The date on the letter was the 14th of October, 6 years ago, 4 months before Eleanor had ever arrived at Ashford House, and 2 years before Agnes had begun, apparently, her 9 months of walking to east doors. The letter was a lie. Someone had commissioned it. Someone had ensured it would be filed and indexed, and never questioned. And that the Duke of Ashford would believe his mother was buried in a parish churchyard in Northumberland he had never visited because it was too far and the grief was too settled. And a man with estates in 4 counties did not have the luxury of his own mourning. She read it a second time. She read the physician's name, a man called Prescott in a parish called Callanwick. She read the careful phrasing of the death notice, which managed, without lying outright, to leave no space for question. It was the work of someone who had thought through the consequences and prepared accordingly. It was, she thought, the work of someone who had done this kind of management before and expected it to stay managed. What Eleanor did not yet know was who had commissioned it, or why, or what it would cost Agnes to be believed. What she knew was that the letter existed, and that she was holding it, and that the woman in the anteroom with the bent silver frame was alive. She carried the letter to Agnes. Agnes looked at it for a long time without touching it. Her gray eyes moved over the physician's words, with the careful steadiness of someone reading a record of their own death. Then she reached inside the bundle and drew out a second letter, smaller, written on paper that had been folded and unfolded many times until the creases were soft as cloth. "This is his," Agnes said. "Written in his 15th year. I have kept it." She placed it on the table beside the physician's letter. The handwriting was the same. The loops, the pressure of the pen at the downstrokes, the way the capital R curved and closed back on itself. The same hand, 15 years younger, rounded with boyhood, written with the unself-consciousness of a boy writing to someone he trusted, but unmistakably the same hand that had signed every document in that library's ledgers. Eleanor looked at both letters. She looked at Agnes. "He does not know," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "He was told," Agnes said, "that I had chosen to leave, that I had gone north with a man, and died there of a fever. I do not know what words they used exactly, because I was not there when they used them, and I was not permitted to write. For 2 years I was not permitted to write. There was a woman who kept the house where I was put, and she was paid well to keep it, and she was loyal to the money rather than to any other consideration." Agnes's voice was absolutely level. She was describing this the way a cartographer describes a landscape, precisely and without sentiment. "Then I was let go, and I was very far north, and I had nothing, and it took a long time. Other people helped. A vicar's wife in a town called Hawick fed me for a fortnight. A carrier took me south as far as York for no payment. There were others." She looked at the physician's letter again. "It took 8 months to come south, and then 9 months of east doors." Eleanor asked who had done this. She asked because she had to know before she walked into that study with a dead woman's physician's letter and a bent silver miniature, and a son who had spent 6 years not knowing what shape his grief was supposed to take. Agnes said the name. She said it quietly as she said everything, without drama and without self-pity. The name was Constance. Eleanor sat with that knowledge for one breath. One complete breath in and out, while the fire she had laid in the anteroom's grate popped once in the next room. And the house went on around her, as though nothing had shifted. The dowager had been the late Duke's second wife and Richard's stepmother for 8 years before the old Duke died. Agnes was the first wife, the mother of the heir, and she had been sent away 2 years into the new Duke's inheritance with a fabricated death to mark the going. The dowager had the household. She had the ledgers. She had the positions of every document in the library and the loyalty of every servant who had been hired in the last 6 years. She had managed everything which Eleanor had always understood, and she had managed this, which Eleanor had not. Eleanor stood up. She gathered both letters and the miniature, and she carried them out of the anteroom and down the passage toward the study, and she knocked on the door. The solicitor Burnham opened it. He was a compact man of 50, with neat white whiskers, and he looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has not been interrupted by a secretary before, and would like it to be recorded that he finds it irregular. Eleanor did not look at him. She looked past him into the study where the Duke stood at his desk with a document in his hand. "Miss Maitland," the Duke said. His voice was not impatient. It held the quality she had observed in it during the 7 occasions they had spoken. Directly, a flatness that was not indifference, but something else. Something she had always thought was control held at very great cost. "Your Grace," she said, "I must speak with you alone." Burnham gathered his papers. He left without being asked twice. Eleanor had learned that people rarely needed to be asked twice when you spoke in a voice that had nothing uncertain in it. She closed the door. She put the 2 letters and the miniature on his desk, side by side, in the order she had arranged them in the anteroom. The physician's letter, the boy's letter in the rounded hand, the miniature in the bent silver frame. The Duke looked at the arrangement on his desk. He did not touch any of it. He looked at Eleanor. His face was the face she had catalogued across 11 months of quiet observation, the jaw, the dark brows, the gray eyes that she had always thought were the color of November light, particular and steady. The gray eyes were, she realized in that moment with the miniature open between them, the same gray as the eyes in the waiting room down the passage. She said, "There is a woman in the anteroom, Your Grace. She has been trying to reach you for 9 months." She watched his face for the answer. He picked up the physician's letter first. He read it in the way he read everything, completely and without expression. He set it down. He picked up the boy's letter and looked at the handwriting for a long time. Longer than he needed to read the letter's contents. He set it down. He looked at the miniature for perhaps 5 seconds. Then he looked away from it, at the window, at the gray November light outside, at nothing visible. "Burnham filed these," he said. His voice was very quiet. "No, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "They were already filed. Lady Constance's ledgers. The physician's letter is dated 6 years ago, in October. 2 years after the date the solicitor in Edinburgh first wrote about a woman in Northumberland." She watched him process this. She watched the control that had cost him something she could not calculate hold, and then shift, not break, shift, the way a wall shifts when the foundation beneath it moves. He said, "She is in the anteroom." "Yes," he said, "she is alive." "Yes, Your Grace." A very long pause. The fire in the study had been laid properly and burned with steady warmth, and Eleanor watched the Duke of Ashford stand at his desk with his hands braced flat against the surface and look at the bent silver frame in which his own young face sat beside a woman with gray eyes and a white ribbon. And she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the miniature was not already saying better. He came around the desk. He crossed to the door. He opened it and went out into the passage, and Eleanor followed at the distance she had always kept. The distance that was proper and had never, in 11 months, felt entirely adequate. He stopped in the passage outside the anteroom. He stood there for a moment with one hand on the door frame. His back was to Eleanor. She could see the set of his shoulders and the quality of stillness in them. A stillness that was not composed, that was the opposite of composed. That was all the things that did not have anywhere to go for the few seconds before he opened the door. Then he went in. The dowager was in the hall when it happened. This was how these things arranged themselves, not by accident, but by the quality of guilt that pulls certain people toward the places where they are most likely to be exposed. Lady Constance Ashford, who was 58 years old, and had managed the Ashford household since her husband's death, with the authority of a woman who had decided that authority was owed to her, was crossing the hall with her steward when she heard the sound from the anteroom that she had spent 6 years arranging. Never to hear again, not a cry, not a scene, only the sound of a man's voice, very low, saying a single syllable that the walls of a stone house do not swallow the way they swallow other sounds. She turned. She looked at the closed anteroom door. The steward, a young man named Clark, who had been at Ashford House only 8 months and therefore had no loyalty to any particular arrangement, said nothing. He looked at his mistress, and then at the anteroom door, and then at Eleanor, who had come to stand in the passage at the dowager's approach, and whose expression held something that was not triumph and was not anger, but was very clear. Clark had seen that expression before on a witness at court. He recognized it. The dowager said to Eleanor, in the voice she used when something needed correcting before it became inconvenient, "Whatever this woman has told you, she is a disturbed creature who has been telling this story for 9 months. My stepson has been managing the disappointment of sending her away repeatedly." Eleanor said, "He is not sending her away." The dowager's chin lifted. "She is a beggar woman who kissed my stepson's ring on the steps of Ashford House not 3 weeks past, in front of half the street, and had to be removed by 2 footmen. She is not his mother. His mother is buried in Northumberland. His mother," Eleanor said, "is in that room." She held the dowager's gaze, which was the kind of gaze designed to make people look away, and she did not look away. And the letter in the library that was meant to establish otherwise was written by a physician who was paid to write it, and whose handwriting I imagine a solicitor could match to other documents in rather short order. The dowager looked at Eleanor for a very long moment. Nothing in her face moved. She had, Eleanor thought, received a great deal of bad news across the years, and had had a great deal of practice in receiving it without any visible change in the external surface, and she was practicing that now very hard. The anteroom door opened. The Duke came out. He was not alone. Agnes walked beside him, her mud-colored cloak still on her shoulders, her white hair still under its blue cloth, the bundle pressed against her body in his arm's reach. She was smaller beside him than Eleanor had expected, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, and she walked with the precise, careful steps of a woman who had walked very far and was very tired, and was not going to let that be visible. The Duke stopped when he saw the Dowager. The Dowager's face did not change. It was, Eleanor thought, a face that had spent too long being managed to give anything away in the first moment. The hall held perhaps 6 people besides themselves: Thomas the footman, Clark the steward, 2 housemaids who had come from the back passage for reasons they would not have been able to explain, a senior under-footman named Potts, who had been with the house for 20 years, and who had, Eleanor recalled from something she had half heard once, known the 4th Duke as a child. Potts was standing very still. He was looking at Agnes with the expression of a man who has been shown something he had almost stopped believing was possible. The Duke looked at the Dowager. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. He said, "You will leave this house by morning." The Dowager drew breath. He said, "She stays." Those 2 words, not elaborated, not repeated. They dropped into the hall's quiet with the weight of a stone into still water, and the ripples from them went out to the walls and back, and the Dowager's face, for the first time in 11 months of Eleanor's observation, lost the quality of management. Something beneath it rose to the surface, and then was pressed down, and the pressing down was visible, which was worse than if she had simply let it show. She said, in a voice that was half the volume of her usual voice, "She is not who she claims to be." He said, "She is my mother." He said it the way a man says a true thing when he is done not saying it. Potts made a sound. He recovered himself immediately, the professional discipline of 20 years. He looked at the floor. His hands, Eleanor saw, were not steady. The Dowager looked at the assembled hall. She looked at Clark, who looked at the floor. She looked at Thomas, who looked at the doorway. She looked at Eleanor, who had not moved. She left without speaking. She walked to the stairs with the upright carriage of a woman who had always been watched and intended to be watched until she was out of sight, and she went up, and the sound of her footsteps on the stairs was the only sound in the house for a long moment after she was gone. Eleanor looked at Agnes, who had stood through all of it with her hands folded around the bundle and her gray eyes on her son's face, and an expression Eleanor could not entirely read, an expression that held grief and relief in equal measure, the way a room holds warmth and cold in the first minutes after a fire is lit. The Duke said, his voice still quiet, still addressed to no one in particular, "Prepare the blue room." Clark moved. Agnes looked up at her son. He was looking at her with the same gray eyes, the same set of jaw. 30 years younger in the portrait, in the bent silver frame, and 30 years older in the passage, and between them was the specific distance of people who have not yet learned how to close the space that years have built. He put one hand on her shoulder, just his hand. A gesture without ceremony, without announcement, the gesture of a man who had spent 6 years practicing not to need anything, and had forgotten, perhaps, what it was to reach towards something living. She leaned into his hand, only slightly. Only enough for Eleanor, standing at the passage's edge, to see the breath leave Agnes's body in a long, slow, silent exhale, the breath of a woman who has been standing very straight for 9 months, and has at last been given permission to set the weight down. Eleanor turned away. She walked back toward the library. There was still work to be done. There were letters to be considered and a solicitor to be sent for, not Burnham, a different one, and the physician's documents to be gathered for comparison, and the question of what legal recourse might protect Agnes's position at Ashford House through the winter and beyond. Constance would not accept displacement without some effort at resistance. This was the nature of women whose competence had always been their weapon, and Eleanor expected a letter to a solicitor of the Dowager's own choosing within the week. She prepared for it as she walked, ordering the sequence of what would need to be gathered and confirmed, because these things required the kind of quiet, precise attention that Eleanor had spent 11 months developing, and they required someone to manage them, and the person most suited to the management was the one who had found the letters. She understood, as she gathered the papers on the library table, that her position as the Dowager's secretary was no longer a position she held. She understood this without alarm. She had been the Dowager's secretary because she had no other option, and now the arrangement that had made it the only option had shifted. She was the daughter of a Shropshire clergyman with no fortune and no connections, and she was, as of this morning, without her employer. She could register this as a problem. She chose instead to note the letters on the table that still needed ordering and to order them. The Duke's voice found her before she had finished the thought. He said from the library doorway, "Miss Maitland." She turned. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, the same posture she had seen in the anteroom passage, the posture of a man checking himself before entering a room. He looked at her across the library table, with the November light behind him, and the 2 letters and the miniature still on the surface between them. His coat was the same one he wore every morning, dark and correct, and there was something different in the set of his face, not softer, not warmer, but less defended, as though the discipline that was ordinarily turned outward had been turned, for this moment, aside. He said, "You brought them to me." She said, "Yes, Your Grace," he said when no one else did, in 9 months. She did not answer this because it was not a question. He was accounting for a thing, the way men do when they have been presented with an inventory of what they very nearly did not receive. He looked at the arrangement of papers on the table. He looked at the miniature, still propped against the inkwell where she had set it. He looked at her. He said, "What is it that you require, Miss Maitland? From this house, from me?" She looked at him. She thought of 11 months of walking quietly and witnessing everything. She thought of the anteroom and the cold grate and the bread on the tray. She thought of Agnes's hands on the bundle, the grip still strong, the patience without bitterness, the 17 days of walking south from York. She thought of the thread that had pulled in her chest that morning in the front hall, which had not released itself through any of the hours since, and which she now understood had not been the thread of professional duty. She said, "I should like to continue the work, Your Grace." She paused. She added, more quietly, "Whatever the work is now." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that had the color of November light, steady and particular. He was not a man whose face moved easily. She had observed this across 7 conversations and 40-odd instances of silent, watching, and she had learned not to mistake the stillness for absence. She had learned to read the things that happened in the stillness. A held breath, a hand that moved towards something and stopped. A question he had no practical reason to ask. He said, "Come in." He stepped back from the doorway. He held the space open. She walked in. Winter came early to Ashford House that year. The first snow fell 3 days after Agnes arrived, and it lay in the gardens in a clean, unbroken sheet that the morning light made into something worth looking at. The footman Potts, who had known a small, dark-haired boy once and had never said so to anyone in the household, cut a branch of holly and put it in a blue vase in the corridor outside the room where Agnes slept. Agnes saw it when she came out in the morning and stood for a moment very still with one hand on the door frame, looking at the holly in the blue vase. And then she picked up the vase and carried it inside and set it on the windowsill where the light could find. Eleanor was in the library when she heard the Duke's voice in the passage outside on the morning of the 4th day. It was 8:30. She heard him stop outside the blue room door. She heard Agnes's voice, low and particular, and then his, and then what might have been, from this distance, through these walls, a sound she had never heard him make before, a sound that lasted only a moment and was followed by a longer silence. And then his voice again, low and level, as it always was, and she could not make out the words, but she recognized the quality of them. The quality of a man speaking to someone who already knows. She turned back to her work. On the library table, open to a page he had not turned in 4 years, was the book he brought to the small library each morning before the household woke. She had not placed it there. She did not know when it had come to rest on her table, on the page he had always held open, or why he had chosen the library where she worked, rather than any of the other rooms in the house where he might have set it down. She looked at the page. She did not read it. She set her hand very lightly on the cover. The bent silver miniature stood on the corner of the table, propped against the inkwell, where she had set it to keep it safe, and where it had remained through 3 days of documents and preparations, and the quiet procedural work of establishing that Agnes was alive and here and owed whatever the law could provide. The painted face of the boy in his chair, The woman beside him with the gray eyes and the white ribbon, the bent corner of the frame that had survived 9 months of being carried close to a body through all weathers. In the passage, the Duke's voice stopped. The blue room door closed softly. Footsteps came toward the library. She did not move her hand from the book. He came in without knocking, which he had not done before. He stopped at the sight of his book on her table. He looked at her hand on the cover and at the miniature propped against the inkwell, and at whatever was in her face when she looked up at him, and the thing she had watched him hold at such cost for so long shifted again. The same movement as before in the study. The foundation beneath the wall, the thing that had been held in place by the wrong kind of certainty, and was now very slowly being released. He sat down across from her. He did not speak for a moment. He picked up the book and turned one page to a different page and set it back on the table between them. Then he looked at her with the gray eyes that were the color of that morning's light through the window, and the warmth that was in his face was not the warmth of resolution or of triumph, but of a man who has recovered something and is still, quietly, in the first hours of understanding what to do with it. Outside, the snow was still falling. It fell on the gardens and on the steps of Ashford House and on the east door at the corner of the building where Agnes had stood and been turned away and had kept coming back, and inside the blue room the holly stood in the vase on the windowsill, and the light, when it came, would find it there.